I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
Una delle notizie più significative di questi giorni è stata la conferenza SALT, che ha visto la partecipazione del colonnello Karl Nell. L'anno scorso avevamo pubblicato l'intervento di Garry Nolan, quest'anno invece era previsto quello di David Grusch, ma a causa di problemi con Grusch non ha avuto luogo. In sostituzione è stato intervistato Karl Nell, attualmente consulente della SOL. Un dettaglio interessante emerso nei mesi scorsi tra gli appassionati è stato il curriculum vitae del colonnello Nell. In esso egli stesso ha evidenziato di essere stato responsabile tra il 2000 e il 2003 del recupero di sistemi strategici e armi convenzionali in Iraq. Questo ha rapidamente alimentato speculazioni riguardo un suo possibile coinvolgimento nel recupero di UFO, anche in considerazione del suo lavoro alla UAP Task Force, come spiegato in questa stessa intervista. È evidente che qualcuno deve pure essere responsabile del recupero degli UFO, e lui in effetti è un ottimo candidato. Nonostante possa risultare un po' fastidioso, interromperemo l'intervista diverse volte per contestualizzare le dichiarazioni più importanti, ma troverete l'intervista integrale sul canale. Sebbene il colonnello Nell abbia fornito informazioni di rilievo, riteniamo necessario contestualizzarle adeguatamente. L'intervista risulta molto interessante e sobria, ma non le contestualizzazioni, nemmeno quelle del prossimo episodio.
And I'm very lucky to have Karl Nell here joining me for this conversation. Karl, thank you so much for coming. And Anthony and AJ over at SALT, thank you so much for hosting this. So Karl, maybe to begin, can you share a little bit about your background, who you are, and perhaps why people should care what you say?
Sure. Well, thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And it's a fantastic event, and I'm glad to see a large bunch of folks that stuck it out to the end for this talk. So I was fortunate. I had a four-year ROTC scholarship to Penn. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. The Army sent me overseas to do signal corps engineering projects, so I did a lot of strategic comm projects in Europe. I ended up working in Army Space Command. I commanded a satellite ground station, war trace to the Joint Chiefs. I spent some time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The Army ultimately sent me to get a master's in mechanical engineering, a master's in strategic studies, graduate work in computer science. I was on track to stay in, but I decided that I wanted to pursue more of a technical career. So I got out and ended up working at Bell Labs, which was a fantastic place. Unfortunately, I was there during the trivestiture that folks may be familiar with, where the company got split up. I left Bell Labs and ended up working in Lockheed Missiles and Space. I worked at Northrop Grumman. I've ran strategic technology programs in the defense industry, worked for a lot of the three-letter agencies, ultimately was a deputy CTO for a $2 billion company. I was a vice president general manager of a Northern Virginia-based R&D firm. I stayed in the military, in the reserve. I commanded at every grade level through brigade. I was fortunate to stand up the Army's newest expeditionary MI brigade. I was the deputy chief of staff for a combatant command. Ultimately, this experience sort of combined to give me the opportunity to come in and advise Army Futures Command, the largest reorganization in the Army Reserve since really 1973, on how the Army could be more effective. And my last assignment was involved with the UAP Task Force, which maybe is the most apropos for this discussion.
And so, Karl, here's the million-dollar question. Do you believe that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet?
Right. So non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
And so, Karl, that is quite a bold statement. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
And Karl, what evidence have you seen? What was the moment where you develop this level of conviction? Because what you're saying is extremely consequential and very important, and I know that a lot of people here even perhaps may not believe that statement.
Right. Well, probably a better way to ask that is, how can the folks in the audience come to the, a common understanding of what this phenomenon is? And so there's sort of two tracks here. One is from first principles, and another is actually from the data. So let's take a look at the data. So we can look at some folks that have very high level access to information, like Paul Hellyer, who is the defense chief for Canada, has come out and said the same thing.
Karl Nell dà credibilità all'ex ministro della difesa canadese Paul Hellyer, purtroppo deceduto nel 2021, il quale aveva sostenuto varie teorie cospirazioniste sugli UFO, inclusi gli aspetti finanziari. Va ricordato che il Canada è uno dei paesi più trasparenti al mondo, se non il più trasparente. Per questo motivo i cospirazionisti più ferventi hanno preso le sue affermazioni alla lettera. Hellyer è stato un testimone di rilievo durante la disclosure del 2013. Nei prossimi giorni pubblicheremo separatamente tutta la sua testimonianza, che va interpretata con cautela, sia perché risale a 10 anni fa, sia perché non presenta prove concrete. Tuttavia Paul Hellyer è stato effettivamente il ministro della difesa in Canada e Karl Nell gli riconosce credibilità. Per trasparenza vi informiamo che nella prima versione del nostro episodio numero 1, su questo canale avevamo incluso le dichiarazioni di Paul Hellyer. Successivamente le abbiamo rimosse, perché ci sembravano esagerate, poco contestualizzate e fortemente cospirazioniste. Questo per spiegare quanto sia difficile districarsi da notizie e dichiarazioni in questo ambito.
To our esteemed Honorable Paul Hellyer of Canada, we would give you 20 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name, as I said, was Paul Hellyer. I'm a former Minister of National Defence for Canada. I served in 3 governments during a total of 23 and a half years as a Member of Parliament. Although as Minister of National Defence, I had sighting reports of UFOs. I was too busy to be concerned about them at the time because I was trying to unify the Army, Navy, and Air Force into a single Canadian Defence Force. And that itself was a kind of battle to the finish. So this was not high on my agenda. But about 10 years ago, I started getting interested due to a young man from Ottawa sending me material on the subject. I told him I was too busy to read it, but he had confidence that someday I would. He sent me a copy of Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. It took me a while to get around to reading it, but I took it for my summer reading in 2005 and was really impressed with what was contained in it. And what I thought to myself is there are huge issues here, huge issues. And the American people and the people of the world have a right to know what's going on because they're part of it. It's not just an isolated thing. And so after confirming the contents of the book with a retired United States Air Force general, I accepted the invitation of Victor Viggiani, who's over here somewhere, and his cohort, Mike Bird, to speak to a symposium at the University of Toronto. And I said, UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. That gave me the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to say so unequivocally. Since then, I've learned a lot from many sources, including a number of the fantastic witnesses that we have heard these last 4 days. They were so outstanding, I was just really blown away with them, the amount of information that was available. And I appreciate every single one of them. But because I'm not a ufologist, I'm a politician, there are only a few things that I want to add in that particular realm. First is that about in the 1960s sometime, there was a flotilla of UFOs headed south that crossed into NATO territory in Europe. And the Commander-in-Chief of the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Europe was naturally very shaken. Fortunately, or maybe divine providence, before the panic button was pushed, the flotilla turned around and headed back north. Obviously, they had thought maybe they were Russian, and they were very concerned about it. Anyway, an investigation was launched into this whole subject, and a document was prepared which concluded that at least 4 species had been visiting Earth for thousands of years. And this is my own view at this stage as well. So, except for that, there are just a couple of things that we've talked about that I'd like to refer to. And one was that we were referring to them as they until this morning when Linda Moulton Howe, I think she was the first one, actually named 3 different species. I have brought my latest book called Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, as an aide-memoire, and I name 5 different species here. I'm aware of more now. As a matter of fact, I saw a document just a few days ago that mentioned 20. And I think you, Mr. Chairman, were interested in some of the places they might come from. And I have in here Zeta Reticuli, R-E-T-I-C-U-L-I, Reticuli, the Pleiades, Orion, Andromeda, and the Altair star systems. So I don't think we can any more refer to them as they, because they're not an amorphous mass. They are different species and consequently may have different agendas. I don't think we can say that they all have the same agenda any more than we could say that the United States, China, and Russia had the same agenda. Our real interests may be very similar, but as of now, our perceived interests are still quite far apart. One more observation before I begin what I want to say, and that is that we spent quite a bit of time talking about the 66-year-old cadavers, and I was glad to have Linda this morning finally say that there are live ETs on Earth at this present time, and at least 2 of them probably working with the United States government. The other species that I learned about not too long ago was called the tall whites. And this is when Paula Harris broke the story just a few years ago. And through her good offices, I had the chance to talk for about 3 hours with former Airman Charles Hall and listen to this absolutely fascinating story of how he was working with, first of all, he was scared out of his skin, but after that, when he got to know them, how he was working with, and finally they became to trust each other and have a good working relationship with the tall whites at the gunnery range at Indian Springs in Nevada. And these tall whites were living on United States Air Force property and working in cooperation with the United States Air Force and sharing technology with them. He wrote a book, incidentally, called Millennial Hospitality. There are 4 different versions, but Paula says that Millennial Hospitality number 2 is the best. I think that's the one I read, and it's a very interesting read if you want to sort of get inside the problem of what it's like to bump into these people floating across the terrain in the desert. Well, enough on that for now. My interest is in full disclosure. And my only caveat is I think probably I would say 95 to 98% full disclosure. I know of 1 or 2 things that I'm not sure should be in the public domain, at least yet. They will be someday, I'm sure, but not maybe immediately. But just as children survive the idea of the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus when they become adult, I think that tax-paying citizens are quite capable of accepting the new and broader reality that we live in a cosmos teeming with life.
So we can look at some folks that have very high-level access to information, like Paul Hellyer, who was the defense chief for Canada, has come out and said the same thing. We can look at Ham Eshed, the head of Israel's, or former head of Israel's Space Force, has said the same thing.
Dopo Paul Hellyer non poteva mancare Haim Eshed, un altro personaggio amato dai cospirazionisti, di cui John Ramirez ha discusso nell'episodio numero 13. Ramirez ha dichiarato che Eshed è stato oggetto da parte della CIA di chiaroveggenza, conosciuto anche come il termine remote view, mentre veniva visitato dagli alieni, citando anche il documento ufficiale disponibile al pubblico. Haim Eshed è un generale israeliano e un professore universitario, noto per il suo ruolo come capo del programma spaziale di sicurezza del Ministero della Difesa israeliano. Ha guidato la direzione spaziale per 3 decenni, contribuendo significativamente allo sviluppo delle capacità spaziali israeliane. Haim Eshed in pratica è stato il capo della Space Force israeliana e viene spesso citato dai cospirazionisti per le sue dichiarazioni insolite su Marte e gli alieni. Questo episodio sta diventando il più cospirazionista tra tutti quelli pubblicati e non è difficile capirne il motivo. Nella stessa frase abbiamo menzionato CIA, alieni, UFO, chiaroveggenza, Space Force, israeliani e Marte. Nonostante ciò è importante sottolineare che qui facciamo sempre molta attenzione. Tuttavia oggi non è stato possibile non portare le loro testimonianze. Ci dissociamo da queste dichiarazioni colorite e poco contestualizzate e non supportate da prove. Ma tant'è.
All right, moving on, break out the theremin because this next story is just begging for a spooky sci-fi background. After 30 years at the helm of the Israeli space security program, and after receiving 3 Israeli security awards, retired Israeli general and respected professor Haim Eshed is now unveiling that yes, there are aliens among us, yes, Israel has made contact with them, and no, humanity is not ready for them. Also, before you start doubting his words, the 87-year-old Eshed was clear in his recent interview with the Yediot Ahronot News that he's not talking about immigration, but rather about a Galactic Federation complete with an underground base on Mars, where there are American and alien representatives apparently present. He also explains that President Trump both knows about them and was on the verge of disclosing their existence, only to be persuaded not to by the Federation, in order to avoid mass hysteria and panic here on Earth. Apparently, humanity just still has a long way to grow before we can understand the gravity of their presence. The final question, however, is what do they want? But perhaps thankfully for us, Eshed says that it's essentially just to research and understand the fabric of the universe.
Now let's go to the Galactic Federation. And as you can see, I'm just jumping all over the place because I want to cover a lot of things. Eshed is not a NASA guy in Israel. A lot of folks thought he's this NASA guy, you know, like the NASA administrator of Israel. He wasn't. He's closer to being the counterpart to the director of NRO. And he, as you know, made these statements about the existence of a Galactic Federation and the fact that the US government knows about the existence of the Galactic Federation. And it was remote viewed. January 13, 1988, and there's the URL if you want to pull that up. In the notes, it said that the interviewer or facilitator was ED, and the remote viewer was MR. So ED could have been Major Ed Dames. You know him from being a frequent guest on Coast to Coast AM. And MR is likely to have been the late Mel Riley. It's a fascinating report of being led into a chamber and having robed figures all around and having to lie down on a table to be examined.
So we can look at some folks that have very high-level access to information, like Paul Hellyer, who was the defense chief for Canada, has come out and said the same thing. We can look at Ham Eshed, the head of Israel's, or former head of Israel's Space Force, has said the same thing. Chris Mellon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intel, SAPCO, has essentially said the same thing. Lou Elizondo has said the same thing. David Grusch has said the same thing. David Grusch cleared for presidentially level material. So you're looking at people that are in a position to know this, and they're telling you the same thing. you could take a look at the Gang of Eight in the Senate and in Congress. So there's 2 members of the Gang of Eight, Marco Rubio and Senator Chuck Schumer, that signed up to the UAP disclosure amendment last year that basically said they're not being told the truth and we need to push forward on that. So that's sort of an overview of some of the data. From a first principles standpoint, what's so unusual about this realization? There's billions of stars in the galaxy. Life here evolved in 500 million years, which is basically a blink of an eye. We've found planets around every star that we've looked at. It's likely that the universe is full of life. If you look at the SETI program in particular, the SETI program has all the same assumptions that you would accept and probably make with respect to this topic, except that they believe that non-human intelligence is transmitting signals here. But at the same time, like, we're not transmitting signals. SETI doesn't transmit signals, and the only signals that are actually broadcast of high enough power into space for somebody to pick up come from broadcast television and ballistic missile early warning systems, which you could argue our technology is moving away from. We're going to satellite, we're going to fiber. Broadcast TV is a thing of the past. And if you get to some state where society is stable, maybe we don't need ballistic missile early warning systems. So the other guy is probably not going to transmit. But what the other guy may do is come here if that's possible to do. And there's physics models that suggest that may be possible.
And Carl, I mean, what you're saying is extremely consequential, and you've referenced other people that have said the same thing that also have similar credibility. There's similar reasons for why we should believe many of these folks, yet the government itself has not formally disclosed. They've been very reluctant to do that. Why? Why do you think that is?
So there's 6 basic reasons, and this, again, you could draw this out from first principles. There's a national security reason. There's the lack of a plan. There's the potential for societal disruption. There's the possibility that there's some non-public agreement. There's the potential for misdeeds and the desire to cover up misdeeds. And there's just the basic organizational intransigence and lack of priority that might be associated with the topic. So all these things are factors. The issue is that really the national security issue subsumes all the others. And so there's an opportunity maybe to contract the national security issue similarly to what was done with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, such that nuclear energy is not necessarily classified and is available to the public. But lack of a plan and the potential for societal disruption are key ingredients that would prevent any responsible leader from coming forward with information that they don't have the means to address in a responsible way. It would be irresponsible to do that.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you have absolute conviction that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet, that there are factions within our own government that know about this, yet we still don't have a plan, and they may represent a security issue. This may pose a threat to humans, yet you still believe that we should disclose. Is that right?
Correct, right. So there's really 3 reasons that trump all those others. And those others are basically valid, like I said. So the first issue is the moral right. The government exists for and by the people. And so the nature of reality is fundamentally not government information. People have a right to know the world in which we live, and the pursuit of happiness requires that knowledge. So that's sort of the first kind of overarching philosophical foundation for this. But, you know, as a corollary to that, if there are misdeeds that were done, then they need to be remediated. If there's lack of proper oversight, which is suggested by some of the whistleblowers, that needs to be remediated. So the first issue is the moral issue. The second issue is being in a reactive mode is never preferable to being in a proactive mode. So reactive mode is basically trying to prevent disclosure. But failing that, you might get a situation where you have catastrophic disclosure that creates all the problems that you were trying to prevent. So a more balanced middle path of controlled disclosure is the best way to do this, which is, again, an argument for some amount of disclosure. And the third part is simply societal advance and global competitiveness. More brain trust needs to be brought into this topic in order to make progress and to improve society. And so all 3 of those things together trump the 6 other reasons for non-disclosure.
And what do you think happens if we don't disclose? I know you mentioned this idea of catastrophic disclosure. Maybe disclosure may be forced upon us. How do you think about that?
So the situation is usually thought of as a binary state. It's like an all or nothing. And people have sort of argued this. But anybody paying attention realizes the government has already indicated that unidentified anomalous phenomena are real, they're not ours, and they're not our adversaries. The Pentagon has said that. Like, for people that are paying attention, like, that shoe already dropped. So for a lot of people, they think that the second shoe to drop is this is non-human intelligence, and maybe the conversation stops there. Like, the president comes out and says, there's non-human intelligence. The truth is that that will precipitate this crescendo of other questions that maybe the government's not ready to answer, that will court, if not precipitate, potential negative ramification for society. And so as an example of this, I would actually point to something from the ancient past, the Bronze Age collapse. So Eric Klein, Princeton University, 2015, wrote a very interesting book called 1177 BC, the year that civilization failed. And so this is well known to current scholarship. Within a single lifetime, all of the very effective ancient civilizations of the Bronze Age failed due to a confluence of reasons that are not necessarily fully understood today. So we're talking about Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Minoan Empire, the Mycenaean Empire, the Babylonian Empire. All these civilizations failed, never to return, other than, let's say, Egypt. And so these were highly sophisticated civilizations with highly developed infrastructures, highly developed administrative states. They were globalist, in a sense, very similar to today. In terms of the known world, the known Near East, they were economically interdependent. They had both diplomatic ties and commerce ties. And yet these civilizations failed in a single lifetime because of stressors that these civilizations collectively could not address within the time frame.
E siamo arrivati alla dichiarazione che noi riteniamo più interessante, cioè la questione della scomparsa delle civiltà antiche, che approfondiremo nel prossimo episodio.